This morning I want to juxtapose some of the gospel lesson from this morning with some words from Pauli Murray to be able to set the context for us today. We might assume that why would disciples who were sent out by Jesus have any trouble, and why would they have seen the devil fall and be sent away? And I want to talk a little bit about that this morning to set the context. Pauli Murray has said, true community is based upon equality, mutuality, and reciprocity. It affirms the richness of individual diversity as well as the common humanities that bind us together. Why does equality, mutuality, and reciprocity have such a difficult operation in the world that we live in today? And why does the gospel, when it starts to proclaim it and preach it and teach it and live it and practice it, get such resistance? We should not be surprised, whether it's in the time of Jesus, when the Gospel of Luke is written, or in our own time. In fact, Pauli Murray would say she never accomplished anything, even though her life is full of accomplishments that she's participating in, because it's a much larger movement than just her, but I'll get to that in a moment. What I want to begin with is to try to identify some distinctive characteristics of the Jesus movement. Some of you know we are studying the book of James, the letter of James, and James is the brother of Jesus, and he's the one who's leading the first early church in Jerusalem. There's also a ministry of the Jesus movement in Galilee. And I want to go back to the early mission of the church. Of those group, they're actually not a church yet. They're still working inside of the Torah, inside of Judaism. They're all Jews trying to sort out the Jesus movement. And there are some important characteristics of their movement that I think are as important for us today to think about in the world that we have to participate in, and in the world that Jesus is calling us to resist, or James is calling us to resist, in order to practice Torah. The first concept that we need to understand is that Jesus' ethical demands in his sayings and teachings, most notably in the Gospel of Matthew, are more radical than the Torah itself. So Jesus is doing interpretation inside of the Torah. And he talks about central moral virtues and requirements that God's will has for the people of Israel. So he talks about concepts like we need to love our enemies. Pretty hard to do in Galilee, with the Roman Empire persecuting over and over again, with the Hellenists attacking the church, attacking the original discipleship groups. And they've been through 200 years of just absolute violence. But we are to love our enemies. There is to be no retaliation. You know, in that Torah, some people say it's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Jesus isn't reinterpreting the Torah and says no retaliation. You're prohibited from making any and all oaths. Your word is your word, and you don't have to swear on a Bible that it is your word. Your word should be your word. Your yes should be yes, and your no should be no. But at the same time, in James's community, there is to be no moderation around following God's will, no compromise, and there's no concern that we're going to try to figure out how to practice Torah inside the Hellenistic or Roman Empire. We cannot do that. It will stain us if we try to be Roman or Hellenist and be a good, upstanding Jew at the same time. So there's a conflict, a tension. And in good community organizing, which Jesus is doing in this gospel lesson this morning, the disciples are sent out into communities to create tension. You go into the town and you say these things of mutuality and equality and you're going to break down all the barriers. Some people are going to tell you to get the hell out of town. Secondly, in James's community, as he's teaching what his brother taught them, under the rule of God, there is no hierarchical structure of society. Under the rule of God, there is no hierarchical structure in society. Jesus rejects all forms of social status, and we can see that over and over again with the people that he eats with, that he heals, that he hangs around with, that he invites into his community. There is no social structures of hierarchical purpose in Jesus' communities. And in that, he says the most important group in the community are the children. The most important group in that community are the children. Just as an aside, the least important people in our national heritage are children. The children are the worst sufferers in our current society, over and over again. More live in poverty, more are dealing with difficult education systems, more have families that are broken up for a variety of social structure reasons. So we can measure what James and Jesus are talking about with where we are today. The third characteristic that James points to in Jesus' ministry is the eschatological action of God. In the traditional wisdom tradition of Israel, there is a process of reward and punishment. And I'm sure we've all heard about the people who talk about God as rewarding and punishing us. Jesus is adamantly against that understanding of God in Torah. He wants to break through and understand that God is like in the natural order. You may remember that setting in Matthew with the birds of the air and how everything is taken care of in this natural order of God. You don't have to worry about being anxious. You don't have to worry about insecurity. You don't have to worry about those things. God is there in that natural order to take care of us. So Jesus is creating a radical countercultural community in what Jesus is doing. And that's what James continues with as they move forward from Jerusalem. Tilliard de Chardin says it another way, which may be helpful for us to think about. Tilliard says, we are not human beings learning to be spiritual. We actually are spiritual beings learning how to become human. And the challenge in the Torah is, how do we practice human with one another? How do we practice the love ethic that Jesus lifts out of Torah, saying, love God, love neighbor, love yourself. Love God, love neighbor, love yourself. Jesus understands from the Abrahamic tradition on that God is compassionate, God is gracious, and God is generous. And the activity that we should be doing to participate in God's activity is for ourselves to be compassionate, gracious, and generous. This practice takes over any precedence of distributive justice. Having been engaged in our criminal justice system for the last decade, we are in a distributive justice system. We are not practicing any of these characteristics of compassion, graciousness, or generosity. Jesus says, in order we should show mercy the way God is showing mercy. So he talks about forgiving of sinners, welcoming of outcasts, succoring the sick and the destitute. God's activity should be reflected in people's activity. So unlike most rabbis that gather their disciples together and go out into the hills and create isolated communities where they just sit and learn the teachings and learn the teachings, Jesus actually has an internship plan. After teaching his disciples about what the Torah is about, he then sends them out in Luke's gospel today to practice. It's not just about believing in God. It's about whether we practice God, whether we trust in God's providence, whether we are free of the anxieties that the world places upon us, whether we will abandon our quest for security and trust in God. Now, James knows that there's a choice that we have to make in this. We can either choose to be friends with God, or we can be friends with the world. And when we understand the difference between being a friend of God and a friend of the world, then we will begin to understand the tension that we live in. James calls this being double-minded. And he critiques his church because they keep practicing this double-mindedness of trying to adapt what they think the Torah says and being a good Hellenistic Jew. Or actually, also, as Paul struggles with, being a Roman Jew. How do I live in this tension of being a Christian following the Jesus method movement and being a citizen of the United States of America? That's the challenge in James's communities. You either live by God's systems of values or you live by the dominant system in values. So I looked at the back of our bulletin and we talk about God's activities. I'm just going to turn back and just so you can hear. We should be going out 2 by 2. And I'm going to encourage us as we get into the fall to think about where are you practicing God's activity. Not what you believe. We may all believe that there should be equality. The question is, where are we practicing equality? So we say that we are demonstrating love in action. That's exactly the language of James. That's exactly what James wants to do. How do we practice love in action? Respecting the dignity of every human being. A little aside. I have a good friend who's the rector up in Pompton Lakes, New Jersey. And he gathered his teenagers, a good big group of teenagers, living in Pompton Lakes, to do a confirmation class. And he said, well, what am I going to tell these teenagers? How am I going to deal with this confirmation program? What am I going to do to wake them up? So the first thing he did is the first day they did an exercise on what it means to respect the dignity of every human being. And he said, for the next week, you're to go to your high school, you're to go to all your club meetings, everything you do, and I want you to come back and tell me stories about respecting the dignity of every human being. Next week they gathered on Wednesday afternoon at 3 o'clock. You couldn't shut them up. They had story after story about how the dignity of human beings were being denied in the high schools, in the supermarkets. They had story after story about how people are denying other people's dignity. And they came alive to what the gospel and confirmation was all about. They said, for many of them, it changed the way they went to high school. From that day on, they went to high school differently. They looked for the places where people were being demeaned, ostracized, oppressed. And they went right at it as they went through the confirmation class. And by the time they were done, they knew they were different than the world wanted them to be. And that they had to live different lives than the world was teaching them. Radical hospitality, solidarity with the marginalized, advocating peace and justice, dismantling structural racism, dismantling the systems of oppression, being inclusive, talking about ecological sustainability. Just to connect what I'm talking about this morning, these are the activity of God that we identify. And we should be working on it 2 by 2, 3 by 3, small groups. And we want to help people do that work. That's the challenge of being a Christian congregation, is to figure out where your participation with God's activity is, and then to support it. So I'm going to close again with Pauli Murray, who we remember she's just, if you don't know who Pauli Murray is, a little bit about her. She was the first African-American woman to graduate from Yale Law School. She participated in the writing of the Civil Rights Bills, particularly focused on the women's side. It's not just about racism, it's about sexism. And she was very important in making that happen. She was the first African-American woman to be ordained in the Episcopal Church in 1977. It's an incredible life story. She is transgender, probably, even though most of her life she didn't know what was going on. And she is being lifted up now as an important person. If you see the life of Pauli Murray, you can see her being raised up at Rutgers University and talked about as a woman that we should know about. We should honor her and we should know her story. So true community is based upon equality, mutuality, and reciprocity. It affirms the richness of individual diversity as well as the common humanities that bind us together. Let us go out and participate in the activity of God. Not just talk about God, but be the activity of God in the ways that this congregation has identified that we will do it. And let's identify other people to do it together with. Jesus was no dummy. He didn't send them out individually. He sent them out two by two. We need support. We need help in where we're going to work on this. And I encourage you to identify it and to raise it up, and we will affirm it and support it. Amen.
Amen.